So welcome back to Untermeyer Gardens. We've been covered in snow for a month. We spent a lot of time in the greenhouse, but this is also a good time for us to take a look at our tools. And what I'd like to do is just go through the tools we use regularly here at Untermeyer, and maybe you can add some to your inventory in your home garden. The one tool that if I had to be relegated to one tool in my shed, would be a nursery spade. This is a fairly heavy tool. This one has an all metal handle and a nice blade on it. Don't use this so much for digging, but for cutting the soil and cutting roots and getting things loose so we can dig that out with our scoop shovel. Which I go to. So I don't like to dig and cut with this particular tool. Once I've loosened it up with the spade is when I like to grab the scoop shovel and then pull it out of a hole or transfer it from one spot to another. So these tools really do go hand in hand. I almost never use one without the other. And if I were going to use one again, it would be the spade as opposed to the more common scoop shovel. Snuck in behind here, we have a smaller spade. Some people call this a perennial spade. It's even hard to find them with a short blade, but we just take a grinder and cut it to our height, our length. I often use this in lieu of a hand trowel, but it works really well in tight borders and in tight beds where you don't want to be disturbing other plants that are in the garden. So once we've talked about fine digging and close borders, a lot of times when we're digging a new bed or a new hole for a tree, we need what we call a pick mattix, and so it has a pick on one side and sort of a digging blade on the other. Again, a very heavy tool. You can swing it over and get a lot of momentum to cut roots and into heavy clay soils, and it does work really well to cut roots with the fine blade. And if you need to move a rock around, you can use the pick to do that as well. But when you're going into new soil, I always like to have a pick mattix along with me. And then our penultimate digging tool that I learned whenever I first started gardening, helping my grandfather dig out potatoes, is a potato fork. In the garden, we almost just call it a digging fork. And we use this to get into the soil and loosen up roots or pull plants out of the ground without having to lift a whole bunch of soil with it. So it kind of gets in there and filters out, for instance, our tulip display. When it finishes in the spring and we pull that out and we're going to put the annuals in those beds, we use this digging fork to get those tulips out. I've used it to take out swaths of Pachysandra, and it just makes it a whole lot easier to dig out the plants without having to dig up all the soil as well. And then the last digging tool, which sometimes you don't want to admit you have to get into, but when you do need it, it really is super useful. And this is a digging bar. And you can see it has two different points on this particular one. Very heavy steel bar, but this allows me to get underneath rocks and then lever them out of a hole that I might be digging for a new tree. And here we have a bit of a blade that can get through some roots, or if you have rocks in a certain situation, it's a way to get these out. But a lot of times this tool will be used for getting rocks out of beds and tree holes. So those are largely our digging tools, and I'd like to step over here and take a look at some of our rakes. So now I'd like to take a look at our rakes. We basically have two kinds of rakes that we use here at Untermeyer Gardens. One is what I call simply a soil rake, and this is used to level beds or to move soil around. And there are a couple different styles with any tool. The most important thing is that it fits you and is sort of an extension of your body or your limbs. I prefer of these two styles this more square headed rake, which allows me to move soil around typically with the tines, but then I can turn it over and level things out a little bit better, or pull rocks out of the bed with the flat edge. So I just find this a bit more useful. I think this is a more common rake that you find in typical hardware stores and such. It does serve the function of a rake, but I find it's a bit vulnerable with this particular attachment. It can be a little bit weaker and tends to break there if you overuse the rake, and you can't get the same sort of control with that. But again, it's all about what tool fits your style and feels comfortable in your hands and that you can use for a longer period of time. Spring rakes or leaf rakes, there's a multitude of styles for these. I do like this particular style. There's a bit of a spring here that holds the tines in place and gives it a function. Every bit of this particular rake can be replaced, so you can just replace parts if anything breaks. It's a fairly decent quality material too, so if these tines happen to get bent out, you can bend them back into shape and they don't get brittle and fall off. I prefer these over a plastic rake. I certainly prefer the tines that are level across the top as opposed to curved, which you see in a lot of places. The ground isn't curved, so I've never understood why you need a curved rake, so really prefer these. And then we have them in 3 different sizes depending on where we're working. So it can be for final dressing of a soil bed, getting it prepped for planting, or to remove leaves is the most common use, is to pick up leaves in the fall or just debris throughout the garden. And this smaller one is great for getting into the borders and around plants. We try not to use blowers in beds, and a lot of times the blower can blow soil off your root zone, so it's nice to get in with these small rakes and get around the crowns of plants with those. So lots of rakes to choose from. These are the 3 we like to use at Untermeyer. So next I'd like to look at these 3 cultivation tools. By cultivation, just disturbing the surface of a bed or a path, and really a weeding tool, a long-handled weeding tool in a lot of ways. This arrowhead tool is great for a bed that maybe doesn't have so many weeds and you just want to get new oxygen into the bed, great for vegetable gardens per se, and simply using this arrowhead to get down into the ground and work away from you and just disturb the soil a little bit, and you end up with more oxygen in the soil, and you can do a little bit of weed cultivation with that. But the tools I really like for weed cultivation, and this can work in the beds or in the paths is great, is a scuffle hoe. And this is a bit of an older style that we started out with, and you can see it's quite well worn. These used to be squared off, and now they're quite rounded. But it allows you to get underneath the surface of the soil or your path a little bit and cut weeds off right at the crown, and so it's a good way to get into there. This particular, I call this sort of a horseshoe style scuffle hoe, is not as effective because this back blade is not sharpened and the attachment doesn't allow you to use the back blade. And so more recently we discovered this particular scuffle hoe, which has a triangle shape to it. It gives a bit more mobility in the garden, gives you a bit more dexterity, and all 3 edges can be sharpened. So when you get down in the ground, not only does it work on the push to get weeds away and cultivate, but when you pull back you can also get out, so you're kind of doubling your efficiency with this particular scuffle hoe. Must have for any garden. So this last little group of long handle tools I'd like to introduce you to do several different jobs. I'm not sure exactly why we even have this one hanging in our tool room. I don't find it hugely useful, maybe snow and ice a little bit, but what I do see is people use this a lot to try to move mulch or wood chips, and it's really a struggle to get into the pile and actually grab a hold of the chips. The blade just gets stuck on entry, and people really struggle with moving this around. What we do instead is we use a pitchfork. We don't throw any straw around, we don't throw any hay around, we're not a barn, but what we do use this for is our wood chips and for our mulch, and it's an invaluable tool. We couldn't get through a spring season without a handful of these in the garden. And another odd tool that I don't see a lot, and maybe a lot of people don't have a huge use for it, but when you're out in the woods working with brush especially, or you have a brush pile that you want to pull back apart, so you have a tree that fell down and all the wood got stacked up and it intertwines with each other, it's great to use this bent fork to pull all that apart. We don't use this a lot in the garden, but when it comes time to need it, this is the tool we grab.